Welcome to Bloomberg Power Players, the series that talks to some of the most influential figures in the world of sport about their rise, the success of their sport, and what the future holds. It's a sport that's produced arguably the greatest athlete of all time, Muhammad Ali. Centuries-old boxing is now a billion-dollar business, with some fighters earning hundreds of millions of dollars for every single bout. One man who's been behind some of the biggest fights this century is the British promoter Eddie Hearn. Now, the most recent of them, this year's heavyweight title rematch between Anthony Joshua and Alexander Usyk. He's the son of the fellow promoter, Barry Hearn, a larger-than-life personality who's never been afraid to be at the center stage with an ambition to dominate the world of boxing. Bloomberg's Dani went to speak to Eddie Hearn for our brand new series of Bloomberg Power Players.
Hi, Eddie.
Hi.
Thanks for joining.
Thanks for being here in our office.
Yeah, and I actually want to start here in Brentwood, where you spent your childhood, and now you're in a world that's tough. It's violent, both physically and often metaphorically as well. Did your childhood prepare you for that tough world?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of like first generational wealth. My dad is from, working class stock, from a council estate in Dagenham, made money. I had a privileged upbringing, but I had a working class dad who was petrified of me being a spoiled rich kid. He calls me Silver Spoon. Like, that's just my nickname.
I've heard before you
Exactly.
were born with a silver spoon, but you had to polish it as well.
Yeah, I turned it gold. That's what I say to him. But he was, it's very important that the work ethic that he had growing up was instilled in me, and that's how I was raised. And everything's kind of geared through sport.
Right.
So, I always.
Did he ever try to shield you though from the sort of more tough?
No, he wanted me to be in there because he was petrified of me being that kid that he hated growing up. The kid that had everything, really. So he loved me being in that world with him. I remember being with him in back road kickboxing events in Thailand, with him in Bangkok. That were pitiful places, and that was part of growing up. I followed him everywhere, all the shows, around the world, and because that was a lot of the times that I got to spend with him, because he was away a lot. But going back to sport, everything was geared around sport.
Right. And you followed him into sport as well, and into Matchroom, and when you did, you inherited his rivals as well. When you started, they were men decades older than you. What did it mean to be so young against those men?
I think you're just more fearless. You're naive, which I definitely was when I went into boxing. But that helped me because I had a plan, I had a vision, a strategy that many thought wasn't achievable. But because I wasn't tarnished with the bitterness of the boxing industry or that frustration of the boxing industry, I went with what I thought was achievable.
Do you think it's still bitter in a frustrated industry?
Terrible. And I've been around boxing since I was 8 years old. But I've been working in boxing for 12 or 13 years. And it affects you because there's very little loyalty. The ups and downs of, staging a major event around the world, and then next week, the day before, a fighter's out with an injury, or is he really injured, or, you have to sleep with one eye open because it's a very competitive world in and outside of the ring.
Well, you say there's no loyalty, but looking at you and your fighters, you're very close with them. I think of Anthony Joshua, for example.
I think that we really work off the basis of, if you want to be with us, then we will, of course, give you all the respect in the world. We don't tell lies. We're full of integrity. We're honest. We want to be a part of that journey with you. And sometimes you have relationships where it's almost as though contracts aren't required because you believe in someone so much, and that could be Anthony Joshua or Katie Taylor, and before them, Tony Bellew, Darren Barker, Carl Froch, people that, you wouldn't turn their back on you. And that's a nice feeling. And when they give you that loyalty, you give it back to them tenfold. So, but you're in a world, it's prize fighting.
Right.
These men and women are getting paid to fight.
But when you are that close with them, does it prevent you from being fully objective?
I want to be close with a fighter because I want to wear my heart on my sleeve. The best nights for me or where I'm jumping up and down, looking silly, diving over the rope, celebrating. Because again, it comes down to sport. I'm a failed athlete, really. If you ask me what I would have wanted to be, and as a kid growing up, was a sportsman. But this is the next best thing. You know, my dad always said to me, if you can get 1% of the adrenaline that a fighter gets when he walks to the ring or when he wins the world title, you're a very lucky man. And sometimes I feel like it's
Do you get
60
that
or
adrenaline
70%.
or nerves before a fight, let's say?
Yeah, all the time. But, you know, nerves slowly fade and eradicate as you get used to them. It's just like a fighter. You know, when you make that walk for the first time, it's very different to when you make that walk for the 7th or 8th time. It's just like doing a press conference. You know, the first press conference I ever did, the major one, was for the world heavyweight title. I was shaking. I had to sit on my hands while I was speaking. Now, you know, I'm quite famous, but I don't have notes.
Yeah. Well, speaking of which, Eddie, do you consider yourself a salesman?
Absolutely. That's my greatest skill. That's all I am, really.
So how integral is Eddie as the showman, Eddie as the celebrity to Matchroom into your fighters?
Well, that's what we've built over the last decade or so, is building the brand of Matchroom, but building my brand to make sure that you're not always solely reliant on talent. Talent is always key to a boxing business or any sports business. But if you can build your own brand, so to speak, and we, you know, Dana White, who is someone that I'm, you know, very fond of and I have a lot of respect for, the UFC, same model, and we copy a lot of what the UFC do, and I openly tell them, and that's a big compliment to them. But
the UFC really has just shot up out of nowhere,
incredible,
almost.
yeah. But that's really part of that growth has been Dana White.
Right.
You know,
Are you worried they're stealing your audience though? That
no,
MMA
I think
is
it's a different
encouraging?
audience, but I think it can also coexist together. You know, and I think, you know, I went to the UFC London recently. It was my first time. Loved it. You know, different crowd. You know, not everyone knew who I was. Whereas if I went to a boxing show, everyone would. So, but it's fight sports. So it's, you know, I think they can coexist together. Great organisation, great vision, great, you know, pattern of growth globally, and the kind of thing that we're looking to achieve as well.
But there are a lot of boxing purists out there who would look at, you know, setting up a fight between two YouTube stars and say, this isn't the sport. Is there an element of the business of boxing taking away from the sport of boxing?
Yeah, I think in anything that you do, you always have the temptation to, I wouldn't even call it sell out, but to move away. The reality is the hardcore element of any industry is a much smaller market than the casual audience within that market. And that's so true in boxing. Hardcore boxing fans, who are the beating heart of the sport, are a small minority versus a potential audience for a YouTube fight between KSI and Logan Paul. You have to keep evolving, you have to keep trying things. It's hard for me because I'm a hardcore boxing fan.
Yeah, so does that make you uncomfortable? Those
Yeah,
kinds of
very
things?
uncomfortable. When I did that fight, you know, at Staples Center in LA, it was incredible. We had 7 million people watching the press conference, right? We had 15,000 in Los Angeles. The viewing figures were huge globally. But I did feel very uncomfortable at the press conference.
So would you do something like that again then?
No, I wouldn't. But I learned, I understood the audience. You know, there was that was good also. Talk about my brand. That introduced me to a whole nother world. When I'm walking down the street, different people are talking to me now through that event.
So you say you wouldn't do a fight like that again, but is there some degree to which that's inevitable, that that's the way the world's moving?
Yeah, I think, you know, you've got someone like Jake Paul, who has turned YouTuber to boxer. So that's kind of, you get away with that. But YouTuber versus YouTuber, you know, I'd like to think that our business is in a position where we don't have to necessarily go down that route. I feel like it's important to concentrate on real boxing, which still has a huge amount of growth to take part globally. But we're also led by numbers. You know, we're led by subscription, we're led by gate receipts, and clearly that was an event that was extremely successful.
Coming up, Eddie Hearn talks about taking on America.
You know, we upset a lot of people. Every door that we tried to go through was being shut on us.
Welcome back to Bloomberg Power Players. It was 2018 and Eddie Hearn signed a groundbreaking broadcasting agreement with the streaming giant DAZN. The deal with his company, Matchroom Boxing, was worth $1 billion over 8 years, making Hearn the sport's first billion-dollar promoter. Let's rejoin Dani, who puts Eddie Hearn on the spot about big TV deals.
You first heard yourself called a billion-dollar promoter. What did that make you think?
It was a nice feeling. I mean, we made a lot of mistakes when we went into America. I think sometimes the marketplace and America in general won't quite recognise the British humour or sarcasm. I think, you may agree with that. But
I might.
And I went in very bullish, very bullish. I mean, there was a big debate about, when we did that $1 billion deal with DAZN, do we tell anyone how big that deal was? And my response was, yeah, absolutely.
Why?
That's me. Because I think if you're going into a marketplace with, no brand presence, no brand profile, you have to make waves, you have to create noise. And I'm not a believer in moving in quietly and slowly taking our time. But, there was a debate going on at the time that maybe that was an approach that worked for us. But I don't feel that's my mantra or my style. I wanted to go in there and I wanted to be a disruptor. You talk about
Do you think it's worked?
Paul. Yeah, I do. But it took 3 years to work, and I thought it would work instantly with the budget that we had. We upset a lot of people. Every door that we tried to go through was being shut on us by the industry. Why would you want to let this Brit into our market? We almost have to get together to stop him. But at the same time, that's the worst thing you could do to me, because that made me work 10 times harder and made me 10 times more committed personally to get to where we wanted to get to. And fast forward 3 or 4 years on, and particularly the signing of Canelo Alvarez, the pound for pound #1, the biggest star in America, has put us on the map as really the biggest promotional company in America.
How do you weigh that up between growing globally with Canelo, for example, versus retaining that mom and pop UK family run feel of this business?
The beauty of our business is we are a family business. And the story of Matchroom is incredible when you think that 40 years ago this year, this business was created under a snooker hall in Romford by my dad and Steve Dawson, who's still here, and his secretary, who's still here 40 years on. And, any family business, I think the most difficult thing is to transform that family business to, a big national business, to a global powerhouse. Because it's the transition. You come from a different mentality as a family business, but that's helped us in our mindset. Here at Matchroom, we very rarely, although we are having to now, recruit at a senior level. All our senior executives, all our board members have come from 15 years old, 16 years old, because you have to understand the mindset that we have. We take this very personally.
How do you make sure there's diversity then when it is people who've been with the business for so long, especially in a very male-dominated world?
I mean, some of our senior directors here are female. My sister sits on the board. She's the former producer for Premier League football at Sky. Emily Fraser, who runs our multi-sport division, started at 17 in this business. So it's about giving people opportunity, of course. And now, because of the growth globally, we are having to see some senior hires come in as we move to the inevitable stage, probably, of an IPO in years to come. And that's my mindset. We got to a place probably 10 years ago when my dad said, I can't believe where this business has come.
Why IPO? Why is that in the future?
Because for me, I feel like that's the next general step of succession, of success, of growth. What are the fundamental next steps you can take to prove yourself as a global powerhouse? And that's something that we will consider in time. But the only way I can be recognised is to outperform anything that my dad ever achieved. So to take the business from major national business, which to international global powerhouse, talk about floating on on the New York Stock Exchange. That
but is there not a fear you all of a sudden become beholden to these shareholders who have perhaps different goals than you?
Definitely, but you have to weigh that up with growth. You can't, and this is an ongoing argument with me and my dad, and probably it's only in the last year or so he started to understand my ambition of we can't be that family business and move globally in the way and with the speed that I want to. So something's got to give. And he has always said, I will never, we're not answering to anyone. We do what we want, we make our decisions. And maybe it'll stay like that. But we also understand that you get to a point that to reach the next level, you have to make changes. And
so is that you disagreeing with him then?
Yeah, absolutely. We disagree all the time. You know, I mean, he's happy where we are. Our numbers are through the roof. You know, the growth over the last 5-10 years has been incredible. And you know, as a standalone family business, probably one of the biggest in the country.
Yeah. Well, to that growth point, we were talking about that DAZN deal in 2018. At the time, you had said the growth, it's not in pay-per-view, it's streaming. Do you still stand behind that? Yeah,
I do. I think that there will be certain fights and there'll be certain individuals that the pay-per-view model will only ever exist for. Canelo Alvarez is a good example. Anthony Joshua in big fights against Usyk, Tyson Fury. But we made our move away from Sky, which was our boxing broadcaster for 12 years, because we felt there was too much pay-per-view.
Was that a hard decision to make?
It was, but again, it's still built behind the global mindset. DAZN gave us the opportunity and the ability to create localized events in markets of great importance, and we couldn't do that with Sky. And of course, the money was significantly more.
I mean, I think about broadcasting rights, and they feel like they're hotter than ever for sports. You have Amazon getting into the game with tennis, football. Have they reached out to you at all?
Yeah, of course. We speak to all broadcasters, all platforms.
Would you do something like that?
Yeah, I mean, we're in a great position where we're content owners. We're rights holders. You know, we run sports, different sports, 10, 11, 12 sports, where we create global calendars, you know, as almost the governing bodies for those sports. So we own the IP. So we're extremely powerful in that position in a world, as you said, where sports rights are becoming more and more valuable. So, you know, the emergence of streaming partners, whether it's Amazon, whether it's, of course, DAZN, who are a huge partner of ours, and Sky, you know, all these linear broadcasters as well are emerging their digital offerings. Doesn't matter if it's Sky or BBC or ITV, you know, BBC iPlayer now all of a sudden becomes huge. I mean, we just did the World Snooker Finals in Sheffield, 4.4 million audience for the final, you know, huge numbers. And across iPlayer, you know, you look at the numbers from their digital offering, and that is the future. And that's one of the reasons we made the move, not just because of the money and the ability to grow globally, but because we truly believe that streaming is the future.
Coming up, Eddie Hearn tells Bloomberg what the future holds for women's boxing. Welcome back to Bloomberg Power Players. So what about the future of boxing? Recently, Eddie Hearn promoted the fight between the Irish boxer Katie Taylor and the Puerto Rican fighter Amanda Serrano. It was at Madison Square Garden, it was in New York, and the bout was described as the biggest women's fight of all time. Now, it's one of many big changes in the sport, according to Eddie Hearn.
In terms of looking towards the future, what is women's boxing going to be?
Women's boxing, obviously, through April 30th at Madison Square Garden, has changed forever. And actually, it's quite funny because I'm negotiating a fight at the moment. It's not as big as Taylor Serrano, but it's a big fight. You know, it's a big undisputed fight in women's boxing. And I would say that the value of that fight prior to Taylor Serrano has at least trebled. And the numbers that are being offered back and forward are numbers that I never expected to see. I mean, look, it was well documented. Both fighters made in excess of 7 figures at Madison Square Garden, which was groundbreaking. Now, I'm not saying that's going to be a norm, but the money now in women's boxing is significantly changing.
What do you think would be the normal then?
I mean, you know, for a major fight like that, they could be making 6 figures or just over, you know, 100, 150.
Is it hard to cultivate the talent in this world?
It's hard. The problem with women's boxing is the deepness of talent. You know, so the high end, the elite level of women's boxing is incredible. Katie Taylor, Serrano, but there aren't. You know, in the male side of the sport, you know, you could make 10 great fights in the division. In women's boxing, maybe it's just 1 fight in the division, but that's changing because these individuals are setting the standard, raising the bar. You know, paving the way for young female fighters to actually have a big future within the sport. We're seeing more female fighters than ever walk through the doors of local boxing clubs within the community.
Eddie, do you get pushback on, okay, so on one hand, you know, this groundbreaking fight with women in boxing, and on the other hand, you know, setting up fights in Saudi where women only just recently were able to drive?
Not really. And, you know, one of the mindsets of Saudi is to try and bring women's boxing into those events. So I think that, you know, we've staged one event in Saudi, which came with some criticism, but also was a huge success.
Personally, did it feel strange?
Not really, because, you know, I was dealing with people, individuals, you know, the sports authority there, that I saw the vision that they have. And, you know, you'd always get the difficult questions. But from a sports infrastructure perspective and from a building of sport within that region, for me, it's exciting.
So you don't think it tarnishes the reputation?
I don't think so. And you know what as well? It's prize fighting. It's very difficult for me to say to a fighter who is putting their life on the line every time they walk through the ring, you have an opportunity here to earn 4 or 5 times more.
I gotta tell you though, if you have shareholders after you IPO, this kind of stuff is important to them, this ESG stuff.
Yeah, maybe. And, you know, that's either something we look at or we move down the Barry Hearn route of, you know, we make the decisions we believe in. I think that we have an obligation to our fighters to maximise their earnings and their revenue in a very dangerous sport. And I don't want to lean on PGA Tour, Formula One, WWE, but these are organisations that are, you know, hard for me to say this, substantially bigger than ours, that are willing to move into that marketplace and stage major events.
Right.
And I just feel that sometimes people don't understand, you know, boxing. If I can make my client 5 times more to stage a mega fight, when I understand and have seen firsthand the risks involved in boxing, then it's something we always have to consider.
If you could change one thing about your sport, what would it be?
Well, I think it would be the ability to make the biggest fights possible in the sport. And the problem with boxing versus UFC, for example, is, you know, you have different broadcasters, you have different promoters. My job is to deliver the best fights for DAZN. Al Heyman's his job is to deliver the best fights for Fox. Bob Arum's job is to deliver the best fights for ESPN. And no one really wants to give and take and share. You're looking to dominate the marketplace with the best product. So the frustration of fight fans versus the UFC, where they have a blanket policy, and fighters, quite frankly, are told what fighters. What
and a lot of them
they're
prevented from boxing as well because of that.
Yeah, and you know, but also the great thing about the UFC business, as I said, is the ability of every MMA fighter wants to be a UFC fighter. You know, and we want to create that same ethos. And,
so, could boxing ever move to that model of one cohesive
we have approaches all the time from people who say, "Can we roll up boxing?"
Any names you want to give us?
No, but can we buy boxing? And the answer is no, you can't. But we can get there naturally through being consistent, through being good enough, and through having a relentless work ethic that will make us unbeatable.
Eddie, one last question for me. What do you think is the biggest challenge this year and beyond?
Time. You know, time, the engine, you know, the love, and just, you know, keep doing what you're doing. The sport can be very frustrating. The business can be very frustrating. You know, you can build something and create it, and a day before it can all fall apart. And, you know, you could be on your knees saying, why do I bother? And the reason is because I love what I do. But the challenge is time. You know, we're creating 50 fight nights a year at the moment, and we want to get to a stage where we're staging 2 events a week globally. So the biggest challenge is to manage that growth as a company that came from a cupboard in Romford.
Eddie, I wish I had more time too. We're going to have to end it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's all for this episode of Bloomberg Power Players. We'll be back soon with another influential figure from the world of sport. Next time around.